Hey, this is Josh, developer of More Run. Welcome to the second preview for the upcoming Emergence League. If you haven't already seen the first preview covering some of the new skill trees and core features, I'll include a link to it in the description. We last left off covering the new module slots, most notably firmware. Now let's look at the league mechanic itself, the only source of firmware drops in the game. In Emergence League, strange rifts have begun popping up, presumably from the anomaly's influence. These rifts overflow with enemies when approached, and once all enemies have been defeated, you'll be presented with the option to seal the rift, opening the new rift tree. The rift tree is a completely new per-run progression system, which allows you to shape how rifts spawn, what kinds of enemies spawn from them, and what properties those enemies have. Every node on that tree makes rifts more difficult in some way, but also more rewarding. You must spend all points before sealing the rift, which then drops all loot which was generated from the enemies killed during that rift. The size of the rift determines the difficulty of the enemies that spawn and how many points you'll gain at the end. Generally speaking, the more consecutive rifts you seal within a run, the larger the rifts you'll see. The rift tree resets each run and is designed to be a tree where there's no clear best choice unless you're targeting specific skill achievements. So there's a lot of room for experimentation here, and you'll go into each run with a specific rift configuration probably in mind. Now, to talk about the next component of the rift tree, we'll need to revisit firmware a bit. I've simplified firmware slightly since the last video. I want to make sure the crafting system I'm about to describe is well designed before layering any more systems in. Each firmware has 4 implicit modifiers and doesn't roll prefixes or suffixes on drop. When the firmware drops, it must allocate points between its implicits, and it must apply positive modifiers to at least one property and negative modifiers to at least one other property. After that, though, anything goes. So you could get a very average distribution or a very focused one. Here's an example of a firmware that rolled almost entirely average, slightly better or slightly worse than the default firmware in most regards. On the other hand, though, here's a firmware that rolled very poorly in one specific property and very well in another. Rifts, however, enable a new kind of crafting, which I'm very excited about. The bottom portion of the rift tree is class specific and allows you to dictate how the drop tables function over the course of each run. Points allocated in this portion of the tree increase firmware drop rates, and then notable nodes on this tree allow you to configure how the implicit selection behaves at the time of drop. For example, I'd like to build a ranger that heavily focuses on sustained overheat for fast corrosive application. So I want to make sure that all firmware that drops for me has positive points allocated to the cooling rate property. I mentioned previously, though, that all firmware must also allocate a penalty on drop. Dictating which property receives that negative modifier is where things get really interesting here. To further the example, I'll go ahead and push the damage bonus property negative because I'm planning a build that doesn't rely on hit damage, so I just need fast attacks. If I want to even further focus the firmware drop logic, I can navigate to this bottom portion of the tree and dictate exactly how many implicits receive positive or negative effects. But for the build I'm going for right now, that's probably overkill and I'm better off spending my points elsewhere. So to be clear, this is crafting at the actual drop constraints at the time of item creation, rather than crafting after the time the item has dropped. I'm genuinely not sure if this has ever been tried in an ARPG, and I'm really excited to see how it plays out. Still, I also know that this is a fairly complicated system for those who just want a classic Survivorslike experience without all the min-maxing. So I've made sure that this system is entirely optional. If you choose, you can completely ignore the bottom half of the rift tree, and you'll still be able to enjoy the full scope of the game. Your build just might be a bit less focused and a bit less optimized if competing on the leaderboard versus those who learned and engaged with this system. One last thing about the firmware drop portion of the tree. Since this tree is class specific, multiplayer has unique handling for it. When the host allocates points to the firmware portion of the tree, each guest then gets to allocate points to their own instance of that tree, which then dictates their own local drop behaviors for firmware. This makes sure that even if 8 players are all running rifts together in multiplayer, each player can still interact with this system individually. Next up, One More Run is getting unique items in Season 3. This starts with the design from Trashman Works, our Season 1 champion, and it's a unique firmware. Trashman's 3-step customer satisfaction program transforms the fighter's traditional directed missile launch into a bombardment of scaling severity. The first stage is a cluster bomb effect, which will provide a great targeted area damage option while still being fairly responsive and fast-paced. Stages 2 and 3 become much slower paced but higher damage. At League launch, only Stage 1 will be available, and then Tim the Gnome will provide a means to progress the unique to Stage 2 and eventually Stage 3 via quests over the following weeks. A few notes on the unique design, which also tie into the previous firmware topic. You'll notice that this firmware is dropping according to the exact same implicit constraints as the firmware I showed previously. It's then adding unique modifiers above and beyond those constraints. So if you want a customer satisfaction program firmware that has high missile damage, for example, you should target that in the rift tree so that when the unique does drop, the drop constraints are already in place to give you the implicits you want. Since this unique's design is Trashman's reward for winning Season 1, and he's always been a fighter main, I'm going to give it a bit before adding unique firmware for the other 4 classes. They'll be layered into the mid-season release though, and will add similar gameplay variety. Now, I teased it a bit in the first video, and I'll show it a bit more here. In Emergence League, there will be exclusive, permanently unlockable skins. These skins will not only reskin your character, but also your attacks and abilities. These skins will only be unlockable during Emergence League. After that, they will never become available again. I think that's important so that anyone who does achieve unlocking these skins has something that they can bring into multiplayer as a sign that they were here during the early days of One More Run. And keeping that fidelity by making sure that there's no further unlock routes for these skins in the future helps to preserve that. To that same effect, any unlocks achieved during the demo will carry on to the full game. As to how you unlock the skins, though, that only becomes available once the anomaly has fully materialized. As soon as that occurs, the community will be presented with a uniquely challenging encounter. Once that encounter is completed, these skins are unlocked. Take your time though, guys. I'm happy to have more time to work on these and make the effects look as cool as possible beforehand. I'll do one more mid-season video once we're approaching the anomaly completion to fully cover these skins in more detail. Alright, that's it for the preview. I can't wait to see you guys in Emergence League coming up on June 19th.